president or our governor of the state, the county mayor. All of those will impact our congregation. And of course, to pray for our elders as decisions will be made in the future about when we will encourage people to meet. And continue to remember too, our widows and our elderly folks who are isolated. And if you haven't been making calls or visits, I would ask you to consider doing that, either through notes or through phone calls or through porch visits, that there's a real need, and it's easy when you're isolated for this long to feel lonely. And it's hard for me to identify with that completely, because I think I could walk off in the woods for like 2 months at a time and not miss anybody. But so it's hard for me to identify with that feeling, but I know other folks are not that way. And I'm like people just fine, but I'm also, I'm my second favorite person. So, when you put that in mind, I don't mind being with me. And it's hard when we don't feel that way to remember that not everybody feels the way we do. So you may be content with all the family time and all the time at home, but reach out to those who, there's nobody to talk to, there's nobody to be with, nobody to, share this time of confusion and chaos with. One of the things that stinks to me about things being different, though, is that this summer, I love the Olympics, and the Summer Olympics has been delayed. It's not going to be this year, may not be next year, and I hope that it will be. And I always liked Jim McKay's Wild World of Sports. I don't know if y'all remember that intro, the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat, and the guy tumbling off of the ski jump there. And I've always loved that time of year. When I was growing up in junior high and in high school, I grew up in Searcy, and my high school used Harding University's facilities, which Harding's got a first-rate track. And I know that's kind of rare for this part of the country, and they had big track meets all the time. And when I was in the 7th or the 8th grade, I watched a high school track meet. These were both two pretty big schools from East Arkansas, and they both had a really, really good high jumper. And these two jokers would run up and take, you can imagine for a moment that maybe the table is instead pads. The pads for the high jumper are about that high. They've got to set out at the track at Columbia State if you want to see them. And the two standards with the bar, and they would go and jump backwards like you do and clear that bar. And they kept going higher and higher, 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", and they'd both jump it. 6'5", 6'6", still both jumping. 6'7", 6'8", 6'9". Now in high school, that's crazy. That's crazy high for a high school high jumper. By the time it was over, one of them had cleared 6'11", and the other one had cleared 7 foot. And as an 8th grader, I remember, you're not supposed to be able to jump that high. But these two guys did that. And that's what I want you to think about. I used to coach track too, briefly, until my career was ended by discus to the head. But that's a different story. But in track, there's all kinds of events where they have the standards, and the bar just keeps getting higher and higher. You think about hurdles. They just they keep raising it. They raise it based on ability and distance of the race. So the 300 hurdles girls race is a low hurdle, and the 100-meter guys race is a high hurdle. It's 9 inches higher. And when you look at the other things, high jump and pole vault, and they keep increasing that bar, making it more and more difficult to get over. And I want you to think about that, because that's where we get our phrase to raise the bar. You've probably heard it before, talking about raising expectations. Well, God's law, in a certain sense, is like that. When we look at the Ten Commandments, it's in effect God establishing a minimum standard of what adherence to his law looks like. And a lot of people see the commandments as a type of bar for us to get over. That God has given us these understandings and these obligations, this barrier, and if we can get over that, we're good. Well, over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about it. And last week I mentioned how the Ten Commandments really break down into 2 sections. The first 4 commandments are commandments that revolve around God, that make God special and expecting us to recognize that special nature of God. that we put God first, that we put away our idols, especially ourselves, that we remember God and His name and His day and that He is holy. But the second half are focused on our behaviors. These are the bars that I'm talking about. These are the minimum standards of human behavior. So last week, we talked about to honor our father and our mother, that we honor them by obeying them when we're young, that we honor them by how we live as we get older, that we live in a way that's in line with the way we were raised, the principles we were raised with, and that we take care of them as they age. But this week, we're going to take this same analogy, this idea of raising the bar, to the next commandment. Go ahead and turn to Exodus 20, and we're going to see this next hurdle, which certainly on first glance looks like it is as low as a hurdle can be set for moral behavior. And that's kind of that's why I'm using this illustration today, because this commandment, verse 13, Exodus 20, it's the sixth commandment. We've made the turn, we're over halfway through after today with the 10 commandments. And in most English language translations today, almost every one of them translate this verse as "you shall not murder." Now maybe when you were young, you heard it from the King James, "Thou shalt not kill." And to kill is a little bit higher standard than murder. But I'm looking out at the audience today, and I wouldn't say that, we do still just have a fraction of our body meeting together, and that's okay. If everybody was here, I probably couldn't say this with as much confidence, but I'm fairly certain none of you have committed murder. I'm not, absolutely positive of that, but my guess is, this is, when you talk about bars, this is about as low a hurdle as it can be. Everybody knows that you're not supposed to kill somebody, that universal laws of nature tell us that "thou shalt not kill" is a pretty low hurdle, and murder is even lower than that. There's a big gap between killer and murder. The Hebrew word here is a word, and I don't read Hebrew, I've never studied it, but from what I could find preparing for this lesson, it's a word called retzak, which means that originally it can be translated as murder, but it has a wider range of meanings. And this is what the source that I went to described it as. It says, it generally describes destructive activity, including meanings to break or to dash to pieces, as well as to slay, to kill, and to murder. Just that alone, I think, helps. That we shouldn't do things that are destructive and harmful. But listen to this commentary. Matthew Henry, and if you've ever had anybody in your family that was a preacher or a teacher, if they've got commentaries in their home, Matthew Henry's commentaries, they used to be these little blue books that about that thin or about that big. They're pretty well known. He was a biblical scholar in the 1700s, and lots of people have read him over time. This is what he says about this command. So he's obviously referring to it in King James language, but this is his thoughts on this. The sixth commandment concerns our own and our neighbor's life. "Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not do anything hurtful or injurious to the health, ease, and life of thy own body, or any person's unjustly." Now that's a little bit weirdly phrased, but basically he said you won't do anything that hurts or injures the health or ease of the life of your own body or your neighbor. He says this is one of the laws of nature and was strongly enforced with the precepts given to Noah and his sons. In Genesis, it forbids the killing. It does not forbid killing in lawful war or our own defense or the magistrate putting offenders to death, for these things tend to the preserving of life. But it does forbid all malice and hatred to the person for that he hateth his brother as a murderer, and all personal revenge arising therefrom, and also all rash anger upon sudden provocations and hurt said or done or aimed to be done in passion. Now I know that with me just reading that, it's convoluted and complicated language that we don't use anymore. But basically, he said that the command goes a lot further than "thou shalt not murder." And he uses as justification this our Savior expounds on in the commandment from Matthew 5:22. We're going to end up in Matthew here in a moment. But I want you to think about that. That when we know, if I just asked you, is there a difference between murder and killing, you would agree that there was. That we know that there may be more to this law. But the word murder is sometimes what we want to hear. We sometimes look at this and see that the bar for this particular command is just barely off the ground. And I'm telling you today, if there wasn't more to it, you wouldn't need a sermon and you wouldn't need a law to tell you that murder is wrong. So why did God put it in the Ten Commandments? Because obviously, there's more to it. When I was a kid, again, when I was back in high school or junior high, our school, 7th grade to 12th grade was considered high school. I think it's the same way in a lot of places, but we had an open campus for lunch, which meant that at lunchtime, nobody watched us and we could go wherever we wanted to, anywhere in town even. And so a lot of times at lunchtime, being in 7th and 8th grade, I and 3 of my buddies would go out and either shoot baskets outside on the playground. We might go to a store and buy baseball cards. We might go and get our lunch at a place not too far from school. Or we might walk over the track and start jumping on the high jump pit, which was fun. To jump and land on that pad is a lot of fun. And we would do that over and over again, and we would feel good about it, and we would start raising it up, but we didn't get it very high. And we'd celebrate our success, and we'd want people to notice and pat us on the back, even though we were barely clearing the bar. And the bar was set really low. And I think a lot of people go through life like that. You see it in the Bible. Think about the rich young ruler. Jesus says, what are the commandments? And he says, and he tells him the 10 commandments, and the young guy says in Matthew 19, I've kept all these from my youth. Look at me. I've never murdered anybody, God, pat me on the back. That's sort of the way we view a lot of the commands of Scripture. We see these really low bars, and we want people to say, I'm proud of you for basically just not being terrible. Think about Paul. Turn to Philippians 3 with me, please. I love Philippians. It's hard not to like this book. Philippians 2 is an incredible challenge to see the world through the lens of Christ. And Philippians 3 kind of continues to expound on that. Philippians 4 is about joy. This Philippians 3 passage, though, Paul says something about himself where I think you can see this attitude. And for a lot of people, especially if you've been raised up going to church, if you know right from wrong, have been taught right from wrong from a young age, it's hard not to feel like Paul feels right here. Philippians 3, starting in verse 3. For we are the circumcision. Now he's referring to Judaism, but he's talking about the church, even here. He's writing to Greek Christians. He says, for we are the circumcision, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus, and put no confidence in the flesh, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. And if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Now listen to the bars that he's telling us about, that he's cleared. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. So he's telling you about these bars, and he's clearing them all. And most people get tripped up in some of those. But blameless. And he's going to say, I've cleared these bars. What's he going to say in the next verse, though? All these things I count for nothing, or rubbish, or trash. Because he knows that even though he's cleared the bars, he hasn't done anything. Let's go back to what Matthew Henry said about the topic of thou shalt not murder. He said, thou shalt not murder is significantly different than the way that it probably, the phrasing there is not the same as this. He says that it means thou shalt not do anything hurtful or injurious to the health, ease, and life. That's a pretty big gap. I don't kill you. I don't do anything that hurts you. That's a wide gap. None of us are guilty of this. All of us are guilty of this. He said that it didn't forbid killing in war or in self-defense or for things that putting people who are guilty to death, because those things tend to preserve life. And that's really a different sermon. whether this is talking about to kill as a soldier or to kill as a member of the state, as a part of the police force or an executioner for the state, or in defense of other people or your own home. He says, put that aside for a second, but listen to this final quote. He said that this law forbids all malice and hatred of a person. And he quotes something. He quotes two different scriptures. And he says, for he that hateth his brother is a murderer, that's one. And then he goes on to say that all personal revenge from hating somebody is also forbidden. All rash anger and hurt said or done or aimed to be done. Now think about that for a second. Everything that we have said or done that hurts somebody out of rash anger, or anything that we aim to do, anything we intend to do. Now think about how the hurdle has just gone up. Don't murder, to don't kill, to don't do anything that hurts somebody, to don't do anything out of rash anger, to not even thinking about doing anything out of rash anger. We've all cleared the low one. None of us are clearing that high one. And you may be thinking, wait a second, that's not what this law is saying at all. But it is. And how do I know that? Go to Matthew 5. If you, I like to think that when I was a kid, as you turn to Matthew 5, and we'll start in verse 17 here in a minute, I really, really enjoyed watching that high jump duel when I was a kid. And it made an impression on me. Obviously, I was 13 or 14. I can remember the schools involved. I don't remember the names of either boy. And being super impressed by that. I remember watching Michael Jordan take off from the free throw line in the dunk contest and dunking it and winning in the mid-'80s. And everybody wanting to be like Mike. They had even had a song for Gatorade, to be like Mike. The only way I could experience that when I was in high school, like I said, just jump over that low bar onto the mat, or on a basketball goal, the best thing that ever happened to teenage boys in basketball goals was that they could be raised and lowered. You start lowering that ball, that goal, and all of a sudden, I'm like Michael Jordan. When I change the standards, I can feel like I'm something like them. And that works the other way too. When we raise the standards, we sometimes realize how dependent we are on God. The way we react when we see a bar that's so high that we can't get over it is either to discount and say the bar doesn't count anymore, anyway, or to do something arbitrary to lower it. But the way God reacts when he sees us doing that is to remind us of where the bar is and who set it there. Matthew 5 is that part of the equation. Matthew 5 is the coach who comes around and he sees the boys dunking on the 8-foot goal and he's like, yeah, let's put the goal back up where it should be. Now, play to that standard. Listen to Matthew 5, starting in verse 17. Right after the Beatitudes, Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. When I was younger, that verse bothered me tremendously, because I had been told that the old law had been done away with, and we were under the new covenant. The old law doesn't matter anymore. So how is Jesus saying, I didn't come to abolish the old law? Because it certainly feels like he came to abolish the old law. But he says, I came to fulfill it. Listen to the next words. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not a iota or a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, just last week, we heard how Jesus feels about them, and we're going to read that passage again from Mark 7 in a little bit. He thinks the Pharisees are lowering the standards. So he says here, none of this will pass. I came to fulfill it all. And guess which law he starts with? Look at the next verses. Verse 21. For you have heard that it was said of those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. He just quoted the command. He said that was the standard. But you all read into that standard the low bar. Verse 22, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge and the judge to the guard and you be put into prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out till you have paid the last penny. All that stuff that Matthew Henry said earlier that seems like he's going too far when he says that this law forbids all malice and hatred, when he says that this law forbids all revenge, then when he says this law forbids all rash anger and hurt said or done or aimed to be done, anything planned to do, we hear that and we're like, that's not what that law says. And then Jesus just tells us that that's exactly what the law says. What we see when we see the Ten Commandments is obviously a simplified, stripped down version of the holiness of God. It's a mistake to assume that if I follow the bare minimums of God's requirements, then God will come along and count me as holy or righteousness based just on my own acts. Just because I can jump over the high jump bar when it's laying on the ground does not make me one of those guys who can clear the 7-foot bar. It doesn't get any easier, by the way. And the verses that, the other quote that Matthew Henry used, and one that we'll use too in a second, you can go ahead and turn there. It's from 1 John 3. Now as you're turning, I hope that we see that at a minimum, this law prohibits hate, whether we express it, act on it, or just feel it. In addition to murder and killing. The quote that Mr. Henry also had in there was this one, for he that hateth his brother is a murderer. And that should sound familiar. It's not a phrase we use very often, but it comes from 1 John 3. And you can hear and feel the bar rising again as you read this passage from 1 John 3. In verse 11, he says, for this is the message that we have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Now we know that we've been commanded to love, but we sometimes forget what that command entails. So John tells us. We should not be like Cain, who was the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, if the world hates you. There's kind of a side note there saying if you do good, the world which does evil is going to hate you. But he goes on to say this, but that's not how we're to be. Verse 14. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. And everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's good and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us love not in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. I hope that you can see what John's done. John has just said that the command to not murder is basically the same command as to love your neighbor as yourself unto death. And you may disagree with that, but go back to what he said. Verse 14, whoever does not love lives in death. That's what the word abides means. We don't use it that way very much. It stays in death. And everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. He's just said that if you hate, you're practically a murderer. We are called to love. that they're the flip sides of the same coin. That the New Testament equivalent of thou shalt not murder is thou shalt not hate. Because we've been commanded to love. Love gives your own life and restores the life of others. Love looks at what people need and decides that I have to give it to them. Verse 18, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. The command, thou shalt not murder, is just the bare minimum level standard for the command to love. When I was coaching track, I saw a lot of weird things happen. I saw high jumpers go up and try to jump over the bar and miss the mat completely, which is a painful experience. You get up 5-6 feet up in the air and you've run at an angle, so you kind of jump over the mat and land on the ground flat on your back, 5 or 6 feet up. I saw when I was in junior high, a pole vaulter go up and using a fiberglass pole, and the fiberglass pole shattered halfway up, and so he fell from about 8 or 10 feet up. I had a trainer tell me that he saw what that happened once, and the pole impaled the guy as he came back down. He survived. I saw a runner at a Lipscomb meet who was practicing going over the hurdles. They were running the infield of the football field, and they jumped over the hurdles right, going one way, and they ran against them, and the hurdles were set up where they're designed to fall when you hit them. But if you run against them going backwards, and I don't mean he was running backwards, but he was running against the hurdles in the opposite direction, they don't go anywhere if you hit them. And he was doing that, and he hit one, and his femur broke. One of our runners, close to, in fact, she doesn't live very far from here, lives close to Sawdust, but she was just a race or two away from the state track meet. And she was doing well with 300 hurdles, a race designed by Satan if there ever was one. Really long, and you add hurdles to it, it's basically a 300-yard sprint, jumping over stuff. And so about the 8th hurdle, there's only 10 in the race, she caught the top of it with the top of her foot and went down, and tracks are built to get traction, so they're kind of gritty, even if they're soft, even if they're the rubberized tracks. And it's not good for skin. So she went down and scraped herself up. That was the last hurdle race she ever ran. Didn't want it anymore. What I'm telling you is that there is pain in not clearing these hurdles. And we fear that pain, and that keeps us from doing stuff that we know we not should, because we know we can't get over the hurdle. We know we can't jump over the bar. We know that if we miss it, it's going to hurt. Heather is a list maker. She likes to get that feeling of satisfaction by checking things off her list, crossing them off her list. My guess is there's at least a few list makers in here with you guys. I've mentioned that, I think, before. She likes it so much, in fact, that sometimes she'll do something that wasn't on her original list, write on the list, and then cross it off, just to get the feeling, because she's, accomplished that thing. This sense of accomplishment is why sometimes when we see God's standards, we are going to lower the bar. We see what 1 John 3 says and what Matthew 5 says. We're like, yeah, that's nice and all. That's not what that means. It can't mean what Jesus is saying it means, because if it means that, then I'm never clearing this bar, and there's pain that I should feel because I'm not living up to God's standard. So we lower it, and we celebrate our success. I haven't murdered anybody. I'm a great guy. Mark 7 is where Jesus told the Pharisees, well did Isaiah the prophet prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And my favorite part of that section is these next two verses, verses 8 and 9. This is Mark 7 still, where he says, you leave the commandment of God and hold the tradition of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. I like American history too, and maybe this is one analogy too many, but we had in our history in the 1830s, and it extended all the way through the 1860s, really something called the nullification crisis, And it was where different government officials decided, especially at the state level, that when the federal government passed a law, whether it was a tariff or a law regarding slaves or something like that the state had the right to just say, we're not going to obey that law. It's happening in our country today, by the way. It happens with marijuana laws on the West Coast, where basically California and Oregon and Colorado and Washington State have all said, we don't care what the federal law is, we're not honoring that law. Well, we do that sometimes with God's law. Andrew Jackson said this about John C. Calhoun, the former vice president and representative of South Carolina. He said about John C. Calhoun's threat to secede, supposedly he said, if you secede from my nation, I will secede your head from the rest of your body. Andrew Jackson thought he was a traitor by talking about this nullification process. Later, he said that, asked him if he had any regrets on leaving office, he said, I regret, after 8 years as president, and this he did say, I regret that I didn't shoot Henry Clay and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun. Now, I'm not here to commend Andrew Jackson at all. My point is, his attitude towards John C. Calhoun was related to the idea that as the leader of this country, our laws are supreme. And John C. Calhoun said they weren't. Well, that makes him a traitor. How do you think it makes God feel when we're told to love our brother, and if they have need, to meet that need? And we say, I like the old standard better. Let me carry hate in my heart. Let me not act on my love. And I'll just agree to not murder them when I feel like it. We can't change God's standards. This is more than about just this one principle. We have a tendency to say, and I mentioned this last week, but I'm saying it again now, and it's going to keep coming up as we come across these other laws, that God's laws don't apply to me when we don't like what God's laws say. There's a reason people want to revert to the Ten Commandments, because the Ten Commandments are the low bar. When Jesus said when it came to fulfill the law, he's telling us what those laws really mean. This is a little bit different than a lawyer looking at laws. The lawyers today are concerned with the letter of the law. Jesus is concerned with the intent of the law. The purpose behind the law means just as much as what's written on the page. So you shall not murder is God telling us you should care for the people around you. So we do that. In the 15th century, Moses brought the Ten Commandments down. They were having a wild party in honor of an idol. In Jesus' day, the Pharisees were ignoring God's law. And in today, we have a tendency to do the same thing. This is more than about this particular command, but about the way that we look at God. Is he the referee in the sky trying to catch us when we break his laws? Or is he the king? On Wednesday nights, we've been talking about the names of God. One of those names is Adonai, which means Lord. You hear it in the Bible. In Acts 2, when Peter says, 2 verses before the verse we know really well, Acts 2:36, he says, let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, a distinction. Christ the Savior, the anointed one, and Lord, your King. When Thomas sees the holes in his hands and his feet, in John 20, he says, my Lord and my God. Jesus is still both Lord and Christ. He is King and Savior. I listened to a sermon this week from Tim Keller, and he said that we don't want Jesus as king, we want Jesus as president. Subject to our whims and our approval, we vote him into office, he rules at our pleasure. But that's not the way it is. We sing a song sometimes that says, King of my life, I crown thee now. Thine shall the glory be. And I hope today that we, looking at this one commandment, use it as a springboard to acknowledge that God should be our King. That we see the bar where it's really at, which is higher than we could ever clear. And we strive to let love, not hate, guide us in all that we do. Because the New Testament says, thou shalt not murder really means thou shalt not hate. Let's remember that and apply it to everything we do this week. Next week, we'll be studying the next commandment, that you shall not steal. And today, the invitation is open to all of us who have for too long played the role of John C. Calhoun and said that whatever God's law is, I'm going to nullify that in my heart and do what I want to do. And so today, if you have not acknowledged Jesus as your Lord and as your King, if you know that you don't follow the command to love others like you should, that you carry hate in your heart, ill will towards others, then know that the command to not murder is really, by extension, a command for us to love each other. Acknowledge Jesus as Lord today, and you have that opportunity to do that now while we stand and while we sing.